Good afternoon. I am Pamela Nadell, Director of American University's Jewish Studies Program, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the second webinar in our series, Europe's Jews Before the Holocaust, where we spotlight the authors of 4 important new books on this theme. Our series is co-sponsored by the American University's Jewish Studies Program and our Center for Israel Studies. As always, I am delighted to join my colleague, Professor Michael Brenner, Director of the Center for Israel Studies, in bringing exceptional programming to our campus and the wider community. I especially want to thank the Center's Managing Director, Laura Cutler, for making all that we do possible. I know that everyone at American University joins me in extending a warm welcome to our audience today. You include AU students, including those currently enrolled in my class on Holocaust history, where we have just for the first time this semester met in person. And you also include friends near and far of our AU and our Jewish Studies program and Center for Israel Studies. You include alumni and academic colleagues around the country and around the world. Now, it is my really great pleasure to introduce today's moderator. American University professor Lisa Leff is director of the Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. She is the author of Sacred Bonds of Solidarity, The Rise of Jewish Internationalism in 19th Century France, and The Archive Thief, The Man Who Salvaged French Jewish History in the Wake of the Holocaust, which received the 2016 Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature. In 2017, she was named American University's Scholar Teacher of the Year. That is our university's highest faculty award. So I am delighted to turn the virtual microphone over to Professor Leff, who will introduce today's speaker, Professor Jacqueline Granick. Thank you.
Pam, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here with you and part of this wonderful programming that Jewish Studies and Israel Studies are putting on together. It's my honor to be the moderator of today's session in particular, because we're talking about a really important new book. The author of this book is today's speaker, and her name is Jaclyn Granick. Jacqueline is lecturer in modern Jewish history at Cardiff University in Wales in the UK. That position is equivalent to assistant professor here in the States. She is the author of International Jewish Humanitarianism in the Age of the Great War, which came out last year from Cambridge University Press. And we heard recently that the book is the winner of the National Jewish Book Award for the category writing based on archival material. She's also done some important other work. She was the co-editor of a special issue of the Journal of Modern Jewish Studies called Gendering Jewish Internationalism, which breaks some important new ground. And she also is currently serving as co-investigator of a project funded by the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council on Jewish country houses, an important many-year-long project. Our plan for today's event is that I will turn things over to Jacqueline to talk about her research for about 30 minutes. And then I will ask her some questions of my own based on my reading of the book. But then I really want to open it up to AU students, AU faculty, and of course, all of our other friends who join us today. If you come up with questions along the way, please type them into the Q&A, and I will read them to Jacqueline when we get to that part towards the end of the session, and we'll end today around 2:10. And with that, I want to turn it over to Jacqueline.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today about my book. Let me share my screen, so bear with me for a second while I do that. All right. One cannot even imagine what hardship the Jews in Eastern Europe have suffered, wrote a youthful Lieutenant James Becker to his parents in Chicago. Everywhere they have been plundered, driven out, homes destroyed, businesses ruined, until one is obliged to wonder if it ever will be possible to reconstruct these people. Personally, I believe that a large percentage never will be saved or restored to their former position. I'm generally quite optimistic. However, after having been given the chance to see the condition of the Jews in Poland, Galicia, Czechoslovakia, German Austria, Romania, Bessarabia, and Bukovina, you can believe me when I tell you that the burden of war has fallen on an undue and unbelievable proportion of our co-religionists in all parts of Europe. James Becker, an American-born, upper-middle-class Jewish 25-year-old, was working as a humanitarian delegate for the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, known as the Joint. He was supposed to be organizing humanitarian relief to save millions of European Jews from the ravages of war. He was the closest thing out there to an American Jewish emissary. Nevertheless, it was an overwhelming task of relieving the suffering of Jewish strangers. They were frustrating and quarrelsome at times, unreformed and wholly un-American. And yet these strangers were his own co-religionists, whom he understood to be like several million destitute kin. His was serious business. This might seem a familiar story, but it was rather unusual. It's not, for example, the story of liberating Nazi death camps, the story which sits at the center of our historical imagination regarding Jewish humanitarianism. It took place a full generation earlier. Nor is it about a hardy white American youth off on a humanitarian adventure to feed the hungry children of Europe, the story which defined mainstream American humanitarianism of that moment. So this afternoon, I will briefly recount this forgotten tale which I have pieced together using thousands of unpublished archival documents filed away in libraries in the US, Jerusalem, New York, and Geneva. This story has much to tell us about the Jewish diaspora and modern international politics, but existed briefly in that particular moment suspended between wars, when European Jewry was in crisis but culturally vibrant, when American Jews had taken on the mantle of Jewish solidarity, and before Israel was an established reality. This is a Jewish story that took place in countless local contexts, but also one entangled in great power and global politics, including America's wartime ascent. Let's start with the war itself. I quote, "The war was a calamity to the world at large. To the Jews, it was a disaster of stupendous proportions." End quote. This assessment of the Great War by historian Abraham Duker was published on the eve of the Second World War. And then, in the inconceivable horror of the Holocaust, the First World War was promptly forgotten, never to be fully excavated. On this map of pre-war Europe, you can vividly see the way in which the western edge of Russia abuts the big neighboring German and Austro-Hungarian empires, with the Ottoman Empire just to the south of a few small states. This whole band would comprise the Eastern Front of the war. In 1914, on the eve of the war, out of about 14 million Jews in the world, 6 million of them lived in the Russian Empire, long legally confined to that shaded western edge of Russia called the Pale of Settlement. The Eastern Front, thus stretched across the region where the majority of Jews in the world lived at the time, from Vilna and Poland to Galicia and Eastern Austria-Hungary, Ukraine, and Romania. Jews also lived throughout the Ottoman Empire, which was also at war. Jewish civilians and soldiers suffered terribly, and about 7 million Jews were estimated to bear the brunt of the war's violence. Jews were subjected to pogroms, including mass rape, destruction of property, and deportation, violence which was directly targeted at Jews, as well as privations affecting all civilians in the war zones, such as hunger, cold, and illness. They were impoverished, displaced, and desperate. You might be shocked to read testimony from this era, especially if you didn't catch Dr. Weidliger's talk last week. Beyond the pogroms in Ukraine, which caused several 100,000 deaths, the war displaced more than 1 million Jewish refugees, created tens of thousands of Jewish war orphans, awakened intense anti-Jewish violence, and brought about the wholesale destruction of the Jewish market towns known as the shtetl, and with it, a way of life. As European empires self-destructed and were reformed as nation-states, Jews were also caught in the crossfire of the Russian Revolution and Russian Civil War, the Polish-Soviet War, and the fighting and collapse of the Ottoman Empire. This is merely to summarize in broad terms for those of you who never thought about the First World War in this way. I want to pause just to ask if you hear Mary Poppins in the background, which my daughter is watching, or if I should.
No, you're good. You're good.
Okay. The Great War and major restructuring of the map and political power in its wake brought the Jewish question into sharp relief from where it had been hanging over European society throughout the previous century. I conceptualize this more as Jewish questions, a series of interrelated, hard-to-resolve issues, all of which fall under a greater question having to do with how Jews were to fit into modern European society. The Balfour Declaration announcing a Jewish national home in British Mandate Palestine, the emancipation of the Jews in revolutionary Russia, and a series of minorities treaties in East Central Europe negotiated as part of the peace brought different possible sweeping political answers to the Jewish question into existence. So in retrospect, we can see that the Great War era marked a crucial turning point in modern Jewish history, probably second only to the Holocaust. Given that, and its relationship to the Holocaust itself, it's remarkable how little we hear about it. As European destruction raged and European charities were themselves engulfed in the war effort, US neutrality during most of the war provided an opportunity for Americans to serve a key wartime role as humanitarians with the support of the US government, which had no government programs like USAID in place at that time. Quasi-governmental humanitarian organizations, such as future President Herbert Hoover's American Relief Administration and the American Red Cross, and civil society organizations, from the Quakers to Smith College to the Rockefeller Foundation to the Near East Relief, got involved abroad. And American Jews specifically founded the Joint Distribution Committee, again, the Joint, to aid Jewish war sufferers. And it positioned itself as part of this plurality of humanitarian war relief organizations. To move aid in wartime, American Jews, the largest group of Jews in a neutral country at 3 million persons, needed to work with the US government, which was the largest neutral power. Cash aid traveled to Jews in the war zones through the US diplomatic pouch and also through family connections. Pre-existing independent Jewish organizations in Central Europe and in Russia delivered the cash and remittances, and US naval ships brought aid past the British blockade to Palestine. After the armistice on the Western Front, the United States provided major food aid programs across Central and Eastern Europe. Hoover's American Relief Administration and the American Red Cross rushed into these fragile new nation states, which are here in purplish, where violence was ongoing. Their programs, aimed largely at children, had several political goals besides altruism, like getting rid of American corn that had been stockpiled during the war, stabilizing Europe, especially in the face of Bolshevism, establishing American scientific practices as the international standard, opening Europe and the Middle East to US business, and keeping America engaged in the world as the US Congress rejected the League of Nations. In the immediate aftermath of that armistice, the Joint jumped aboard these American emergency relief efforts, which helped it reach Poland and later Russia, where Jews were in greatest need. American relief workers were deployed around Europe for this task, which consisted at first of distributing emergency food relief, medications and sanitary supplies, and clothing to help civilians through harsh winters. And here you can see the Joint shipping kosher beef off from New York on its way to Danzig for distribution by a Joint social worker in Poland. Much like American post-war diplomacy was being carried out by the American Relief Administration and through private loans, with the tacit and direct support of the US government, Jewish diplomacy was being carried out by the Joint, a private humanitarian association. Modern Jewish philanthropy required both national and international public spheres in order to operate. And the sudden success of American Jewish philanthropy and diplomacy was contingent not only on the place of American Jews within America, but on America's enlarged role in the world. The Joint paid for fully half of the first shipload of American humanitarian supplies to reach Poland, the first of a pattern in which it consistently paid significant sums for general humanitarian aid, sums on par with governments, in order to justify and secure its own position alongside more mainstream American overseas projects. Taken together, the war experience and its aftermath completely transformed Jewish life across Europe, the Middle East, and America. And with it, international Jewish political leadership shifted irrevocably across the Atlantic as the disaster of stupendous proportions prompted an unprecedented international aid effort led by American Jews on behalf of their suffering Jewish kin. American Jews sent millions of dollars to Europe and the Near East during the war, and continued to do so in its wake. While American humanitarian aid surely saved lives and provided some measure of stability overall, it's probably its Jewish component that had the greatest long-term impact, which I will explain. By 1921, peace was returning to Europe, and the League of Nations was set up in Geneva. The catastrophe seemed to have passed, and the Joint was ready to rehabilitate Europe's Jews before making a quick exit. That same year, however, would bring new crises, pushing Jewish security into the ever-receding distance. Mainstream American organizations left Europe in the early 20s as political violence declined, and the continent overall appeared to stabilize. But the Joint stayed. Though American Jews kept hoping that the situation for Jews elsewhere would get better, there was a need to keep helping, as it became clear that it wouldn't. Evident in the economic boycott of Jews in Poland, a lack of treatment for Jews who contracted typhus, refugee expulsions, numerous Clausewitz restrictions on Jews attending university, and pogroms. Since the United States didn't enter the League of Nations, American Jews had to continue to rely on and advocate for continued American resources overseas to keep up their work, even as they sought collaborations among local authorities and local Jews. Instead of leaving, in the autumn of 1920, the Joint reconfigured itself to undertake what it hoped would serve as reconstructive and rehabilitative work, which would restore European Jews to their pre-war status and still allow the Joint to liquidate itself within a few short years. So rather than organizing work along geographic lines, the Joint would now address issues thematically and systematically. And as the Joint became the only American humanitarians left in the former war zones, American Jews became the face of American humanitarianism overall. There were 4 prongs of this kind of longer-term rehabilitative social welfare work, which began in earnest in 1921. First, refugee; second, child; third, medical; and fourth, economic development work. The Hebrew Sheltering and Immigrant Aid Society, known as HIAS, and Hadassah, which was the American Women's Zionist Organization, also took part alongside the Joint in particular fields and places. Besides peer American humanitarian organizations, American Jews had many overseas Jewish models and potential partners. Since the early 19th century, acculturated Central and West European Jewish elites interceded on behalf of suffering Jews in the East, working with their imperial governments to build Western-style Jewish schools in colonies around the Mediterranean and helping Jews migrate out of the Pale of Settlement. On the eve of the war, these institutions formed a diffuse transnational network across the Mediterranean and Europe to the Americas that mixed philanthropic and diplomatic functions. The Joint picked up these threads from the pre-war Jewish world and reorganized them for the new world order, in some cases restoring European Jewish partners to a new working order, but sometimes creating entirely new structures to make it all work. Gradually, Jewish American workers left Europe and turned over work to local Jews. So this is a map of how that developed institutionally. Furthermore, American Jews made ample use of immigrant mutual aid and diaspora networks when it came to relief, through organizations called Landsmannschaften, which were immigrant mutual aid societies structured around identification with their specific ancestral towns in Europe. Remittances, food packages, child sponsorship, tracing services, purchasing tools for agriculture and industry, and developing a Jewish political economy of cooperatives were all formally incorporated into Jewish humanitarianism in a way unknown to mainstream humanitarianism at the time, blending and scaling up long-standing diaspora and immigrant practices with more formalized and institutionalized transnational interventions. Innovation in remittance and food draft delivery were key to the Joint's whole operation from very early on. For example, the Joint only reached Jews in Ukraine with food when Herbert Hoover began accepting American food package remittances to famine-stricken Russia, a famine which he didn't believe to affect Ukraine until Jews started rapidly to place orders there. In this map, you can see the refugee crisis created by the Eastern Front. The arrows indicate the direction of Jews fleeing as refugees from the war zones along the Eastern Front. Again, more than 1 million people. The Great War marked the most extensive, most rapid geopolitical displacement in Jewish history since late antiquity. When it came to refugee relief, HIAS, the Joint, and a loose network of European organizations were invested in the cause. With Friedhof Nansen at the center of the intergovernmental interwar refugee regime, and America closing its borders in an anti-Semitic xenophobic campaign, Jewish organizations argued over the definitions of refugees and other migrants and devised solutions accordingly. The Joint sought primarily to deflect away attention. It resolved to treat only refugee crises, apart from the rest of its regular relief program, hoping that if it absorbed illegally settled Jewish refugees into its regular programs, refugees would eventually find a way to live in their new places of residence. But HIAS and other migration organizations sought ways to continue to actually move refugees out of Eastern Europe, despite the new global migration regime that both created more paperwork and narrowed immigration places available. HIAS faced significant anti-Semitic pushback as a result, and by the way, continues to do so. The Tree of Life shooter in Pittsburgh blamed HIAS in 2018. The Jewish Colonization Association, which was based in London and Paris, also tried to work with the new international organizations in Geneva to create protections and processes for refugees with limited success. Ultimately, the refugee crisis that had its origins in mass expulsions along the Eastern Front could not be solved. It remained a stubborn human crisis across Europe that persisted into the 1930s as Jewish Great War refugees evolved into a permanently, fundamentally precarious group whose mere debased presence aroused anti-Semitic feeling, and who later could be easily funneled into the machinery of the Holocaust. Meanwhile, deadly typhus disease spread through body lice across still violent Eastern Europe, killing Jews who frequently rejected invasive occasional military programs to delouse them. Various reactive, incoherent international health campaigns, which might sound vaguely familiar, were undertaken to prevent the spread of typhus. But they were more concerned with cordoning typhus off from the West than with compassionately treating typhus where it was already epidemic. And the Joint failed in its effort to coordinate amongst organizations and make them more sensitive to Jewish needs. However, reaction to this failure resulted in the establishment of autonomous Jewish health programs. So Jewish public health initiatives flourished, with American Jews, including Hadassah, acting as the connective bridge from pre-war years. These programs allowed Jews to reconstruct and even seek to improve their status through incremental change without state sanction. Furthermore, medicine was uncontroversial and non-politicized within Jewish communities, and Jewish health professionals were relatively abundant. Unlike battling epidemic disease, which required governmental collaboration that was very difficult to achieve, social medicine could work as a form of apolitical resistance to oppression. This was accomplished partially through the exportation of American nursing practices to Poland and Palestine. And you can see how these Hadassah nurses and the American Red Cross depicted here are presented similarly through shared uniform type, exchanging the cross for a Jewish star. The Joint cooperated with other American organizations to feed Jewish children after the armistice, more successfully than with regards to public health. However, feeding was only a small part of helping Jewish children grow up who had survived the war. The Joint attempted to address the tens of thousands of war orphans by subsidizing them individually, but keeping them placed within local settings and programs designed for all Jewish children, and eventually set up a child sponsorship scheme to increase funds for the issue, but refused to organize child transfers beyond arranging some family reunions. Jews were always concerned about the Jewish future and thus with children. These future-oriented worries manifested in heated Jewish debates in Europe and America over the right way to bring up Jewish children post-war. American Jewish organizations could only achieve so much in terms of exporting progressive child welfare schemes to Poland, though it was easier for Palestine. The vision of child welfare and self-help promoted by American Jewish child welfare experts also depended on an improving economy and the related ability of local Jews to absorb the initiatives begun by American Jews. And when such improvements failed to materialize, the Joint felt morally obliged to continue its work, constructing a social welfare system that in many ways aspired to that of a social welfare state. These adorable images of children at the top in Poland, sunning in a Joint-funded summer colony, which was run by a new Polish Jewish children's health organization it had helped create. In the corner, on an upper corner, on an agricultural colony in Ukraine, and at bottom, in an infant welfare center in Jerusalem, demonstrate how far the Joint departed from mere food provision, deepening its involvement in Jewish society over the course of the 1920s. The culmination of an ambitious and entirely unique campaign to make humanitarianism self-sufficient, comprehensive reconstruction work became the focus of and heir to all previous international Jewish social welfare work. This was a humanitarian response to Jewish impoverishment as a result of war, but also addressed the wartime acceleration of the long-standing Jewish economic crisis in Eastern Europe. Superimposing American wealth and progressivism onto long-standing Jewish self-help ideology, pre-war vocational training, housing construction, and agricultural colonization were revived. Especially in the Soviet Union, they were expanded by an ambitious new program called the Agro-Joint, which seemed to be the best way forward for Soviet Jews after the Bolshevik Revolution. And in this glimpse into the past, you can see that revival of long-standing Jewish self-help efforts to productivize Jews, and especially youth, via philanthropy. Crucially, this reconstruction program also involved the creation of 2 American Western European foundations to foster Jewish microlending and cooperative systems in Eastern Europe and Palestine. The tools of liberal international finance, immigrant banking, and revolutionary cooperative banking met here. The Joint's understated political ambitions lay in building an international, centralized Jewish cooperative banking system. The first ambition was to bring together the fractured and dispersed Jewish world by transnationally interlinking its economy, institutionalizing its ethnic separateness from other political economies. The second was to create a self-sustaining, pluralist, cooperative social system to carry out the work indefinitely. Jewish reconstruction thus sat somewhere between what we might think of today as state social welfare and international development. I've come to see that American Jewish humanitarian activity abroad mimicked the social welfare activity of early 20th century Western states. Intended first to provide relief until Jews in the East could reestablish themselves, American Jewish organizations instead saw the continued precariousness of Jewish life. The dispersed Jewish people, who might have at first placed trust and hope in their new states and the League of Nations to guarantee their security, turned to other options by the early 1920s, to their own diaspora. Although the Joint's American employees nearly all left Europe by 1923, the Joint hadn't succeeded in turning over its work to locals. While many of the old European Jewish organizations were capable of carrying out Jewish social activities, demonstrating the significant successes of American Jewish reconstructive work, they were still impoverished, struggling against economic recession. Children especially held the Joint's attention, and it was their economic future at stake. Thereafter, the Joint continued to dole out money, mainly for the purposes of childcare, loan institutions, medical work, and the occasional refugee crisis. Jewish philanthropy came to redefine many aspects of modern Jewish life across Europe and the Middle East, replacing political rights with food, education, healthcare, vocational training, and cooperative banking. From the beginning of its existence in 1914 until 1931, the Joint dispersed more than $80 million, a sum equivalent to well over $1 billion today. The hope was that an international, low-interest small loan Jewish banking system would keep the heart of the Jewish world running, without too much continued input from American Jews at large beyond an occasional infusion of financier funding and management. Eventually, the Joint came to aspire to a system for redistributing wealth, resources, and responsibility among Jews, and providing a net for the weak, no matter where they lived, and had recognized their own responsibility in sustaining that system. Like all Jewish life, the International Social Welfare Network, with the Joint as its guardian, was fundamentally characterized by its diaspora dimension. To conclude, American Jewish humanitarians looked inward and outward, backward and forward, locally and internationally. They joined America's expanding state at the critical juncture of World War I and used that relationship to provide a humanitarian response that continued in an unbroken chain far into peacetime and then back into war. The Joint sought to fill the vacuum of governance in recent war zones, not with international government, not with sovereign state government, but by developing and creating links across Jewish civil society itself. This story describes a modern world in which the Jewish diaspora ran its own affairs across vast geographic distances, rather than through territorial settlement. This world is a mosaic of Jewish humanitarian projects and organizations with the Joint as its connective thread. In this world, Palestine is a cultural center, one Jewish hub among America, East Central Europe, and Russia. But the project was ultimately defenseless, dependent on international forces beyond Jewish reach, and unable to transcend the 19th century Jewish Enlightenment solutions of self-help and intercession. American Jews weren't naive about the limits of their abilities to solve the Jewish question. As one Joint worker said, it would be a ridiculous contention to claim that any single measure could untie the complex agglomeration of economic, social, political, and cultural knots that go to make up the so-called Jewish problem. Yet there were few alternatives. A worldwide financial depression and the rise of fascism radically reshaped Jewish humanitarianism after 1929 and would soon tragically expose its vulnerability. Thank you. I'm just going to put up this slide if you want to have some more ideas for questions, but I'll take it down shortly.
Jacqueline, thank you so much. This is such a rich project and gives us so much to think about. And now I'm going to ask you, can you all see me? Okay. I want to ask you some questions that from your talk that occurred to me, but also just from reading your book in general. I mean, just before I start, I just want to say to me, what your book really lays before us is that the Holocaust did not start in 1941 or 1939. From the point of view of the Jews who were the victims of the Holocaust, it didn't even start in 1933. We really have to go back to this World War I part, that there was, the very fact, as you say, that the majority of the world's Jews lived in this, along the Eastern Front. I think at one point in the book, you say 70% of the world's Jews lived in the empires in the new states that were created after World War I. So they're dealing with all this upheaval, not just the violence that Jeff Weidlinger talked about last week, which was extensive and unprecedented, but so many different types of disruption and destruction. That's why, he talked about the Holocaust before the Holocaust, and you really show here, not only is that the case, but that the responses of the Jews of the world did not start in the 1930s or after 1941 when the Holocaust starts. They really have their start here. So if we talk about international Jewish responses to the Holocaust, we really have to look at World War I and how American Jews responded to that and how they built up this infrastructure that you describe over the 1920s. And that really laid the foundations for Jewish responses to the Holocaust. And for everybody watching who's not Jacqueline, I just want to say what an achievement it is from an archival point of view to have done this. So little of this has been written about, or where it has been, it's been just specific histories of projects or institutions. So we have some, studies that focus on the Joint or on specific projects in Eastern Europe or other organizations. Like I see someone already has a question about the ORT, another one of these international organizations. But what Jacqueline has done is found a way to talk about them all together and to give us a picture of, what she's calling Jewish international humanitarianism, and give us a way to think about what it is. So with that, okay, I want to jump into some questions. First, to that end, I really see this book as looking at this moment in the history of Jewish international aid. And I thought I would start just by getting you to situate that for us historically. I think we tend to assume that Jews have always done this through the ages, organized when their fellow Jews get into trouble in some other country, they spring into action. What you talk about here is clearly on a scale that was probably never before needed. But are there other, can you do that for us? Can you tell us where this fits in that long history?
Yeah. Well, of course, plenty of what I would say about it is drawing on Lisa Left's own first book. And I think that a major difference beyond scale is also its shift to America and out of formal imperial boundaries. So I think the 19th century, there have long existed Jewish philanthropic and help networks across major geographic distances, hundreds of years. I haven't, gone back to trace that kind of through time forever, but that wasn't new. But in the 19th century, organizations like the Alliance Israélite Universelle and then several kind of related or copycat or competitor organizations grew up in the other European empires and mostly functioned within those imperial lines. They helped Jews that were in need in far reaches of their empire. And so this was the first time that American Jews not only kind of worked on helping Jews who just arrived in America, but also turned around to where Jews had been coming from and tried to provide external humanitarian aid. And they didn't, America, America had an empire in some sense, but it wasn't in Europe. So in some ways, you might think of this moment, some scholars who aren't Jewish historians talk about this moment as being kind of, you can see some kind of like Cold War origins in this moment, and where kind of East Central Europe becomes sort of part of America's cultural empire area of influence. These debates are happening today with what's going on in Ukraine. So that's present, but still there is no formal empire. Basically, the Joint picks up to kind of actually help wherever Jews start to write them from. So the whole project is basically motivated by the fact that Jews in New York start to receive letters from across the Jewish diaspora. And if somebody writes a letter, that they treat it as information about where they should send aid. And so they start trying to design projects to get aid to wherever people write from. And then they start undertaking their own research to find out if there are other places that don't know to reach them. So I think it's a kind of totally different scale for so many reasons. The amount of money, the number of places they're working, the fact that they're doing it in a war, the fact that they have kind of a statistics department, a professional fundraising department, that they have like reconnaissance kinds of missions where they send people out to gather information, things like that.
sounds like it's, from out of something very non-professionalized in the 19th century, this is the moment where you get professional aid workers for the first time, something that looks much more like what you would see in, Oxfam in the later 20th century, right? It must be interlinked with that development.
Yeah.
I'm struck when I read your book, I looked at the titles of the chapters, which focus on the different kinds of projects that these Jewish international humanitarians were undertaking. And they are war sufferers, the hungry, refugee, the sick, child, the impoverished. Those are the areas of aid that American Jews were focusing on. And I was really struck by how, what was being focused on and also what is not there. Specifically political rights, anything seeming political, anything that seemed like political intervention. And I wondered if you could comment on that. Why is this what they did? It seems like, and there's other people who talk, whenever I teach about the post-World War I moment, it seems like the problem facing Jews needs a political solution. Why are these humanitarians seeing it in such different terms?
Yeah, I think what's important to understand about the origins of the Joint and of other Jewish kind of welfare organizations is that they were responding to direct need as welfare organizations in the main, and that if we think like a historian and the way things are able to shift over time, I mean, they're still kind of carrying with them their initial structure and their initial mission, which is to provide ways for people to survive the war. And that's a reason that I call the book The Age of the Great War, and I talk about the war all the time, and something I think other Jewish historians have really missed when they talk about the interwar period, but don't talk about the war, because I think everything that you see in the interwar period is a direct reaction or a result of something that happened in the war, the First World War. But it's also important to remember that a lot of the same people, not the professional social workers, but the kind of leaders of these organizations, and not just the Joint, the leaders of the organizations they help or they help restructure or create across Europe and Europe broadly defined, many of those people came to Paris and they tried to think about other political solutions as well. They tried to lobby at the peace conference, and the result of that was the minorities treaties. So they kind of felt like they had a moment and that was the result, and then there was not that much more to do. The Jewish Colonization and an organization that nobody's heard of called the World Jewish Relief Conference had, / the Committee of Jewish Delegations, had representatives frequently in Geneva at the League of Nations trying to continue to work for political solutions. And they just never really got far. And Americans were not able to be at the League of Nations. And that was kind of off the table as a kind of international political strategy. So what was left open to them was to kind of be non-state humanitarian workers, which the US State Department allowed. They could keep doing as long as they didn't make it too openly political.
Right.
So that was how they had to do it.
So I want to invite those of you out there who have questions to type them into the Q&A. I see we've had some come in, and I'm going to turn to those in a moment, but there's time for even more, so type some in. I'm going to push Jacqueline on this response, though, that she just gave about the kind of powerlessness of American Jews to do things other ways, especially once the peace treaties were over. Because, the obvious question that comes up for me is, well, what about Zionism? Isn't Zionism, or Jewish socialism for that matter, which is also very popular in this moment, there are lots of Jewish political responses, right? This is the high age of Jewish politics. This does not seem engaged in Jewish politics. This seems much more decidedly apolitical. Why is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all about, like, again, I continue to think of it as like it was a response to specific needs of survival. And then it basically, that's what the kind of organization it was. And it worked and it kept growing because there kept being need. But like there were all of those other organizations as well, and they did things and they were part of kind of the broader network of this whole thing. And the joint was not against any of those things. Many of its leaders, including the social worker kind of professionals, took part in these various other organizations. Hadassah was explicitly Zionist, and they worked with Zionists, but they would never kind of take an explicit position on Zionism. Many of them were non-Zionist. It was created to be kind of a joint collection of all different kinds of Jewish political opinions. And they tried, especially in the earliest years, to really stick to that idea of jointness and to have a wide variety of political opinions working together around shared goals of basically survival and welfare. And they recognized that they couldn't completely change the Jewish situation this way, but they also looked at things like Zionism or socialism and saw that those were probably also not going to change the Jewish situation completely, because they would think through the logical ends of those kinds of things and kind of realize, well, how would any of these really work out? How does that come? So they just decided that they're not going to go down any of those routes, and they're always going to stick to a kind of pluralistic, we stay in this together around a shared goal of helping Jews where they need help.
Yeah. I'm going to turn now to one of our questions from the Q&A, which is it's a specific question about the relationship between the joint and ORT. Maybe you'll explain what ORT is, and maybe I'll generalize that question just to say, like, can you tell us about how this whole thing was structured? You've alluded to that there were a lot of different organizations working together. So how did that all fit together? What were their relationships?
Yeah, so I think the ORT is a great case to look at this broader question. So thank you for that question. So the ORT was an organization for vocational kinds of training, agricultural work, but kind of work training organization in the Russian Empire, which was founded a few years before the First World War. And it was, having had a broad network across the Pale of Settlement and ran a lot of schools, I think some colonies, had all kinds of things going on. And it was kind of a Russian answer to the Central European Haskalah, a way of kind of self-uplift in the Russian Empire. But then the war came. And one of the things that the war did was shatter the Pale of Settlement into several different states who were no longer all within one political territory. And so the part of Russia that the ORT was active in after the war was basically only Ukraine. And then there was the revolution, and the ORT was basically made illegal, although it continued to kind of function through unofficially. And so the ORT, and this was true of other kind of Russian welfare organizations, did the same thing. So the ORT was trying to figure out how to connect back to the West to get money the way it did during the war itself. And the ORT was also trying to figure out how to connect itself to the places that used to be in the Pale of Settlement, like Poland. And so what it did was it basically sent missions to New York and created its own kind of international humanitarianism fundraising, and also went to Berlin and like set up a little office there in Central Europe. And then from that kind of created a European ORT network, the World ORT Union, which like had very deep connections to Russia, but instead of being based, so it was sort of like it relocated itself to Berlin, and then all of the previous branches from when it used to be the Russian Empire that had been like within the Pale of Settlement, then those branches became part of the World ORT Union attached to Berlin, which was, and both Berlin and Russia were attached to the Joint. The Joint provided funding for the ORT. Joint basically figured that the ORT was a pretty competent organization. They didn't feel like their methods were the most modern, that they would really, really change Jewish situation, but they were good at what they did. They had the infrastructure, they had the trust. So a lot of the things that the ORT did, the Joint just gave them money and said, great, you just keep doing that. That's fine. Do that. And they really helped the ORT be able to kind of reform itself as a World ORT Union outside of Russia.
Your answer makes me understand how complex this web was, because it's not being directed by one organization. And I see one of the questions is about the connection to the Landsmannschaften. And I know from reading your book that it's also working through Landsmannschaften and even individuals sending remittances. And all that leads me to another question for you, Jacqueline, which is, how did you do this research? Like, given that this is not one organization, most of us, when we write studies, we're writing like the history of some organization. The papers are all in one place. When you're writing about a web of organizations doing overlapping things, and those organizations are based in, say, New York, or maybe Jerusalem, or maybe Berlin, you're saying, but the work they're doing is in Ukraine, Poland, Romania, etc. How do you do that research? How do you think to find this stuff?
Well, I think the fact that the Joint itself has such an extensive and accessible archive was like the first major point that like this could only be done because the Joint formed a kind of coherent backbone, and lots of those other organizations are kind of correspondence with the Joint, so one can access a lot by reading the Joint in many different ways. So that's one thing. I had that like major backbone organization, and I could sort of see that there was other organizations in there that I should go try to track down their records as much as possible. So I traipsed around many different places over many years looking for personal papers, and looking for other institutional archives. And some of those institutional archives are like they've ended up in strange places because of the Holocaust or World War I itself. That was pretty destructive. So it took a lot of piecing things together, but I could kind of do it around the Joint. I guess the other thing is that I really came into this project as an international historian, not taking any specific organization or even any specific nation state as kind of my default frame. I came in from the departure point of, okay, League of Nations, international refugee regime in the 1920s, like there is this kind of international world that emerges after World War I. I first went looking for Jews at the League of Nations to try to understand what happened with the minorities treaties, because this was the big thing of the world, of the peace conference that I'd read about. And then I just didn't find that much in Geneva. There wasn't, I felt like that was really not the story. So then I was like, what is the story? And this was the story. This is the story.
There's a couple questions that have come in about that push more on the politics. Lauren Strauss's question: the American Jewish leadership of the period, especially the American Jewish Committee, is often seen as having failed in their international efforts to protect Jews. primarily because of the passage of restrictionist legislation on immigration in the US? Can we look at the joint, et cetera, for an alternative assessment of the leadership? In other words, should we give American Jewish leaders more credit for finding alternative ways to help Jews when they were failing on other fronts? And then I just want to throw in another question while you're considering, like, is this actually an alternative to the political work? And it's this one. If these Jewish humanitarian workers eschewed political ideology, how did they work with the Bolsheviks and the burgeoning Soviet state and the Soviet Union? So two different ways of getting at why did they seem to throw away politics? What was the situation that might have contributed to that choice that they made?
Yes, I mean, I basically think that that idea of kind of the AJC is not who should be taking the credit, but the joint should be taking the credit. I think that that is true. I think that the AJC is just one of a few, American Jewish political organizations, maybe the best funded, but, none of the kind of like supposedly national level Jewish political organizations of this era, like particularly did that much, had that much money, were respected by the organization, the other Jewish, like the rest of the Jewish world. Like the American Jewish Congress Committee and the American Jewish Congress were like actually very small affairs. I went to looked through both of those organizations' archives as well, and like there's just so many fewer people like working with them and so much less going on. It's much, much less going on. The Joint, I think, is really the major American Jewish organization of the time period, and still a major Jewish American organization that people don't think about because its visibility in America is much less than those other organizations. But its visibility abroad is enormous.
Right.
So I think that that's like important to remember. And I think that there is a whole story to be told about like the Joint and America that I didn't write, but I could have written if I wanted to keep a kind of American story. I felt that this story, however, needed to be told first in order for us to kind of really understand what was happening in America and the Joint. And also, I think one of the strangest things to answer a different part of that question, there's like this assumption that Jewish organizations should have been able to save Jews around the world, and particularly that American Jews should have like been able to do this. But like American Jews were just like private citizens. They're like, why should we have had the expectation that like non-state civilians, like are a very minority population, many of them like first or second generation immigrants, should be capable of like stopping a war or rescuing millions of people? That is a weird kind of assumption that like the AJC could have prevented any of those things. And then I don't remember what the second question was.
The interacting with the Bolsheviks or the Soviet Union.
Oh yeah.
How were they able to do anything across those borders?
It's amazing. I mean, Jonathan Jacqueline's book, Farming the Red Land, and also a newer book by Michael Beiser on the Joint in Russia in its kind of earliest years, both really kind of get into it, but especially Jonathan Jacqueline explores the kind of political negotiations required, and like that kind of major skill at diplomacy, and being able to kind of work across what seem like really hard borders is something that I find like the most fascinating about the Joint. And I think that's another thing to think about when you think about like politics and diplomacy. And I think that like thinking of the Joint as diplomacy rather than politics is like more is a better way to think about it, because it's not like the Joint is politics and it's kind of like party politics or has like an ideology of its own really, but it's all about kind of incredible diplomatic and political skill to work with its own, like the US State Department with national and imperial authorities, like many at the same time, with ones who couldn't talk to each other. I think that the US, that the Joint was the first US organization to get into Soviet Russia and like work there. And that itself, like that's extraordinary. And has created all kinds of problems as well, but also, you know, they could do it. They kind of, Jews lived in all of these places. They did whatever it took to kind of stay within international legal norms and boundaries, but get across these borders.
So one, an interesting question that came in is about non-Jews. What was the position of the local non-Jewish population on the receipt of aid directed only at Jews? Or were these organizations also helping non-Jews? Did this, create problems in that way?
Yeah, so those are some of the problems that I'm alluding to, where, the Joint had enough work on its plate as just this non-state funded entirely by American Jews organization to just try to keep millions of Jews alive and across the world. But from the perspective of every place where they worked, they were concerned that they would kind of create anti-Semitic feeling or something that they would get into debates about, like, well, what does it mean to kind of restore Jews to like pre-war status? Because if their neighbors aren't getting restored to pre-war status, we can't just do it for the Jews. So like, are we just trying to kind of make them equal to their neighbors? But also, how do we do that when we're working in so many different places and their neighbors are different in all of those different places? Like, how can you run a program like that? And so one answer was to provide a lot of funding for general humanitarian aid, as I alluded to in my presentation. So like the first boatload of American humanitarian supplies was paid like half by the Joint, and it didn't all go to Jews. It was like the Joint paying to be part of this general humanitarian world came with this heavy price. They had to pay for general humanitarian aid, even though like US Congress was also paying for general humanitarian aid. So it was like they were expected to do what US tax dollars were doing, like almost as much for general stuff, but they knew they had to. And then they also tried to organize things like at kind of local levels. So they would sort of send money to a specific town in which there were a lot of Jews, but say like, this money is for the town. So they didn't send money to towns that had hardly any Jews. They just didn't send anything at all. But in places that like they tried to target kind of by heavy Jewish population, they would like, that money would be shared by everyone. It was for everyone. And they would kind of play with that sometimes. And like they tried sometimes, like they would write like American really big on their offices. But then other times they would put like Jewish really big on their offices because they wanted like non-Jews to know that the people they were getting aid from were Jews, so that they would be kind of kinder to their Jewish neighbors.
Jacqueline, you've given us so much to think about today, and I'm seeing the clock that we've run out of time. I was gonna ask you, but we'll leave everyone with the thought about the incredible legacy that these programs left on Jewish aid in other parts of the world. There was a question about the Middle East, or on American Jewry in general, so that even though, as you tell it in the book, it's in a way, a tragic story, because in the end, all of this aid did not manage to save European Jewry from the Holocaust. Its legacy is very much with us today. And your book gives us a way of seeing that. I want to thank you for sharing your book with us and to our whole audience. Thanks, Jacqueline. And I want to invite everyone to come back on February 16th to our series, where we'll be talking with Natalia Alexiun about her book, Conscious History, about Polish Jews in the 1930s. Thank you. Thank you, Jacqueline.
Thank you.